The rifle hit the parade ground with a sound like a gunshot, and Cadet Colonel Preston Wainwright IV felt something in his chest snap clean in half. That was the third drop in 10 minutes. The third unforgivable failure from cadets who were supposed to be the pride of Whitfield Military Academy, and the Memorial Day ceremony was in 48 hours. "Pick it up," Wainwright screamed, his voice cracking across the manicured field where 6 generations of cadets had marched before him. His family had donated the flagpole at the center of this parade ground. His grandfather's name was etched on the memorial wall, and these incompetent children were going to humiliate him in front of Lieutenant General Webb and every distinguished guest who mattered. Cadet Okonkwo scrambled to retrieve the fallen rifle, her dark hands trembling as she wiped grass from the stock. She was a scholarship student, the only black female in the honor guard, and Wainwright had opposed her selection from the beginning. Now she was proving him right. Now she was proving that standards meant nothing when the Academy cared more about optics than excellence. "From your position," Wainwright barked. "Again, from the top. And God help every single one of you if another rifle touches this ground." The 8 cadets of the honor guard snapped to attention, their white gloves bright against the polished wood and chrome of their ceremonial M1 Garants. The Virginia sun beat down on their dress uniforms. Sweat carved rivers down, faces frozen in concentration. And from the shadows of the equipment building at the edge of the field, an old man in ill-fitting janitorial coveralls watched with eyes that missed nothing. His name, according to the temporary badge clipped to his chest, was Cornelius. Just Cornelius. The Veterans Assistance Program that had placed him here 3 days ago had not asked for a last name, and he had not offered one. He was 67 years old, though he looked older, gaunt and weathered, with gray stubble across hollow cheeks and hands that seemed too steady for a man who had been living under an overpass 6 weeks ago. He held a push broom that he had forgotten to move for the past 10 minutes, his attention fixed entirely on the young people failing at something he could have done in his sleep. The honor guard began again. The rifle movements were crisp enough at first. Port arms, right shoulder arms, the basic vocabulary of drill that any halfway competent cadet should have mastered in their first year. But then came the transitions, the spins, the throws that required trust in physics and muscle memory and the absolute certainty that your brothers and sisters on either side of you would execute their movements in perfect synchronization. Cadet Okonkwo's rifle wobbled on the spin. She caught it, barely, but the recovery threw off her timing. The cadet beside her compensated too late. The geometric precision of the formation rippled like a stone dropped in still water, and Wainwright's face flushed the color of raw meat. "Stop! Stop!" Wainwright's voice had gone quiet, which was somehow worse than the screaming. He walked toward Okonkwo with the measured stride of a predator who had already selected his prey. "Do you know what date it is, cadet?" "Sir, it is Wednesday, sir," Okonkwo replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon per protocol. "It is 2 days before the most important ceremony this academy will host all year. Lieutenant General Marcus Webb will be in attendance. 2 Marine Corps captains who graduated from this institution will be delivering the keynote address. The governor may attend. And you," Wainwright leaned close enough that his breath moved the short hairs at her temple, "cannot execute a simple rifle spin without looking like you are having a seizure. If you're watching this story unfold from anywhere in the world right now, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment sharing your city or country. Stories like this one, about courage hiding in plain sight and heroes who have been forgotten by everyone except those who truly see, they happen in every community. Maybe there's a quiet legend in your own neighborhood. Someone whose humble appearance hides something extraordinary. Consider subscribing if stories of hidden valor speak to your heart. Now, let us continue. From his place in the shadows, the old janitor's hands tightened on the broom handle until his knuckles went white. His lips pressed together. Something flickered behind his eyes that looked almost like pain, as if watching the young woman's humiliation was causing him physical distress. But he stayed silent. He stayed invisible. That was his job now. Pushing a broom, cleaning toilets, disappearing into the margins of a world that had long since stopped seeing him as anything other than a cautionary tale. Wainwright turned away from Okonkwo and addressed the full formation. We will run this drill until you execute it perfectly or until you collapse. I do not care which comes first. Some of you seem to think that wearing the uniform is enough. That showing up is the same as excellence. Let me disabuse you of that notion right now. The Honor Guard of Whitfield Military Academy has never, in 114 years, embarrassed itself at a Memorial Day ceremony. You will not be the first. The cadets remained at attention, their faces carefully blank. Only their eyes betrayed them, flickering with exhaustion and resentment, and, in some cases, the quiet desperation of young people who had trained for months only to be told they were worthless. It was then that Wainwright noticed the old man watching. Something about the janitor's stillness drew his attention. The man was not moving, not pretending to work, just standing there with his broom like a statue someone had abandoned. His coveralls were too large, bunching at the shoulders and pooling around boots that had seen better decades. But his posture was strange, straight, almost rigid, like someone had run a steel rod up his spine without telling the rest of his body that it was supposed to be broken. "You," Wainwright called out, pointing at the janitor. The old man's head turned slowly, and for just a moment, their eyes met. Whatever Wainwright saw there made him hesitate, made something cold brush against the base of his skull. But the feeling passed, replaced by the comfortable contempt that had served him so well in life. "Can I help you with something? Or do you plan to stand there all day watching my cadets like some kind of vagrant ghost?" The old man blinked, spoke for the first time in a voice like gravel scraping over rust. "No, sir. Just doing my job. I will move along. See that you do." Wainwright turned back to his honor guard. "And someone tell the groundskeeper that we need better screening for the temporary staff. I do not need distractions stinking up the perimeter of my parade ground." A few of the cadets exchanged glances. Cadet Okonkwo's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The old janitor picked up his broom and began pushing it slowly toward the equipment building, his movements precise and economical. Anyone paying close attention might have noticed that his feet never dragged, that each step covered exactly the same distance as the one before it, that his turns were executed at perfect 90-degree angles. But no one was paying attention. No one except Sergeant Major Theodore Vance, who had been watching from the window of his office in the administration building, and who now felt the hairs on his arms stand at attention for reasons he could not quite name. The janitor's quarters were a converted storage closet in the basement of the equipment building, 8 feet by 6 feet of cinder block and concrete floor. A cot had been wedged against one wall. A footlocker that did not lock sat at its end. A single bulb hung from the ceiling on a chain that swayed whenever someone walked on the floor above. It was more than Cornelius Boone had possessed in 6 years, and every morning when he woke before dawn, he spent a full minute convincing himself that he deserved even this much. His routine never varied. For 45, eyes open. For 46, feet on the cold floor. For 47 through 452, stretching exercises that a physical therapist had prescribed for his shoulders 3 decades ago, back when the damage from 10,000 rifle impact had started to make itself known. The shoulders still ached. They would always ache, but the stretches helped, and the routine helped more. Routine was the architecture of survival. By 5 o'clock, he was dressed in his coveralls, his few possessions arranged with geometric precision inside the footlocker. A change of clothes, a razor and soap, a Bible with a cracked spine that he had carried through 4 continents and never once opened. And, at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been white, the items he allowed himself to touch only in the darkest hours of the night. This morning, like every morning, he unwrapped them anyway. The photograph was creased down the center where it had been folded too many times. 2 girls smiled up at him from a backyard he could still describe in perfect detail. The oak tree in the corner. The swing set he had built over one long weekend while his wife handed him tools and pretended not to notice that his measurements were military precise. The girls had been 8 years old when this picture was taken. Elise on the left, already serious, already watching the world with eyes that calculated and assessed. Maya on the right, laughing at something outside the frame, probably their mother making faces behind the camera. Their mother, his wife. The woman whose street Christopher medal now hung around his neck on a chain that had not left his body in 6 years. Cornelius pressed his thumb against the photograph, tracing the outlines of faces he had not seen except from a distance in all that time. They were 34 now. Marine captains, both of them. He knew because he had checked. He had found ways to check, even from the streets. Library computers. Veterans who owed him favors from lifetimes ago. Quiet questions asked in quieter places. His daughters had followed him into the Corps, and that knowledge was a blade that twisted in his chest every single day. He had wanted to spare them this life. He had wanted to give them something softer than the relentless machinery of military service. But he had also spent their childhood teaching them to stand straight, to push through pain, to understand that discipline was not punishment, but freedom. And when he had finally broken, when their mother's death had shattered him into pieces too small to reassemble, they had responded the only way they knew how. They had become Marines. The morning of the aneurysm played behind his eyes like footage he could not stop rewatching. He had been in Washington. The silent drill platoon was performing at a ceremony for the Joint Chiefs, and he had told Rebecca he would be home by dinner. Just one more ceremony. Just one more performance. The platoon needed him. The Corps needed him. And Rebecca had smiled that smile she always smiled when he chose duty over her, the one that said she understood even when understanding cost her something. She had collapsed in the kitchen at 3 in the afternoon. The neighbors found her at 6 when they noticed her car still in the driveway and the lights off inside. By the time Cornelius landed at the airport, she was already gone. By the time he reached the hospital, his daughters were standing in the hallway with faces that looked exactly like hers, and he could not breathe. He could not think. He could not do anything except stand there and understand that the one time it had truly mattered, he had not been there. The funeral was a blur of white gloves and folded flags and words that meant nothing. The weeks afterward were worse. He would walk into rooms and forget why. He would start sentences and lose the thread. He would look at his daughters across the dinner table and see Rebecca looking back at him, and the guilt would rise up like water, filling his lungs. The note he left was still the hardest thing he had ever written. Harder than casualty notifications. Harder than the letter he had written to his own mother when he was 19, telling her he was dropping out of college to enlist. 3 sentences that took him 4 hours to compose. I love you both more than I could say. I am sorry I'm not strong enough to stay. Please live your lives and do not look for me. He had walked out of his own house at 2 in the morning with nothing but the clothes on his back and the photograph and the street Christopher medal. He had not looked back. He had not allowed himself to look back, because looking back meant seeing the life he no longer deserved to have, and that was a weight he could not carry alongside all the others. 6 years. 6 years of shelters and underpasses and day labor and slow disappearance. 6 years of watching his daughters from distances they would never know about, showing up at their promotions and standing at the back of crowds, slipping away before anyone could notice the old vagrant who did not belong. 6 years of becoming no one at all. Cornelius wrapped the photograph back in its cloth and placed it in the footlocker. He touched the street Christopher medal through his coveralls and whispered the same words he whispered every morning. Still here, Becca. Still trying. Then he picked up his broom and climbed the stairs to begin another day of being invisible. The parade ground was empty at this hour, the grass still silver with dew, and the air carrying the particular stillness that exists only in the moments before the world wakes up. Cornelius swept the walkways with methodical precision, his strokes overlapping in patterns that maximized efficiency. He had swept 1,000 parade grounds in his life. He knew their rhythms, their needs, the way morning light fell across painted lines and polished stone. He was finishing the path near the memorial wall when he heard footsteps behind him. Measured, confident, the footsteps of someone who had spent a lifetime walking with purpose. "You are up early," said Sergeant Major Theodore Vance. Cornelius did not turn around. "Work starts at 5:30. Figured I would get ahead of it." Vance walked around him, positioning himself so that eye contact became unavoidable. He was 70 years old, with silver hair cropped close to his skull and posture that would put most active-duty Marines to shame. His eyes were the color of weathered steel, and right now they were studying the janitor with an intensity that bordered on uncomfortable. "What did you serve?" Vance asked. It was not a question. It was a statement disguised as one, an acknowledgement of something already known. Cornelius kept sweeping. "Did some time in the Corps. Long while back." "How long?" "Long enough to know that 5:30 comes fast, and this walkway will not sweep itself." Vance watched him for another moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself, and walked away toward the administration building without another word. Cornelius did not let himself exhale until the footsteps faded completely. Then he leaned on his broom and closed his eyes and tried to remember how to be no one at all. The morning rehearsal began at 0700, and by 0715, Cadet Colonel Wainwright had already reduced 2 cadets to the edge of tears. The pressure was building like steam in a sealed container, and everyone on that parade ground could feel the inevitable explosion approaching. Cornelius watched from behind the equipment building, where he had positioned himself to clean windows that did not need cleaning. His hands moved a rag across glass in slow circles, but his eyes never left the honor guard. 8 young people stood in formation under the Virginia sun, their rifles held at port arms, their faces masks of concentration and barely suppressed fear. The problem was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Their timing was fractured. Each cadet was executing the movements correctly as an individual, but the synchronization that transformed 8 separate actions into one unified performance simply was not there. They were playing the same song in different keys, and the dissonance was painful to witness. Again, Wainwright commanded, "From the inspection arms sequence. And this time, try to remember that you are supposed to be a unit, not 8 separate disasters happening simultaneously." The cadets began the sequence. Inspection arms required each rifle to be brought to a precise angle, the bolt pulled back, the weapon presented for examination by an inspecting officer who would never actually appear. It was ceremonial, symbolic, and when performed correctly by a synchronized unit, it was breathtaking. When performed by 8 exhausted cadets who had been drilling for 3 hours on 4 hours of sleep, it was something else entirely. Cadet Reeves on the left flank was half a beat behind. Cadet Morrison in the center was overcompensating, his movements sharp and jerky where they should have been fluid. And Cadet Okonkwo, despite her obvious talent, was second-guessing every motion, the memory of yesterday's humiliation making her hesitate at crucial moments. Cornelius saw all of it. He saw the way Okonkwo's right elbow dropped a quarter inch during the transition, throwing off her center of gravity. He saw Reeves anticipating commands instead of responding to them. He saw Morrison gripping his rifle too tightly, strangling the natural flow of the weapon through his hands. 28 years of drilling Marines had trained his eyes to catch mistakes measured in fractions of inches and hundredths of seconds. The errors screamed at him like alarms. "Stop!" Wainwright's voice had taken on a dangerous flatness. "Okonkwo, step forward." The young woman marched 3 paces out of formation and halted, her rifle held rigidly at her side. Her face revealed nothing, but Cornelius could see the slight tremor in her hands. She was terrified, and she was trying so hard not to show it. "Tell me something," Wainwright said, circling her like a shark sensing blood. "When you applied to this academy, did you indicate anywhere on your application that you were incapable of basic motor function? Did you check a box that said, 'Please accept me despite the fact that I will embarrass the institution at every opportunity'?" "Sir, no, sir." "Then explain to me why you consistently fail to execute movements that children half your age could master in an afternoon." Okonkwo's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'm working to correct my errors, sir. Working to correct them." Wainwright stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could probably smell his cologne. "Let me tell you what I see when I watch you drill. I see someone who is admitted to this honor guard because the academy needed to fill a quota. I see someone who will never belong here, no matter how many chances she is given. And I see someone who is going to humiliate me, this unit, in this institution in front of Lieutenant General Webb in 36 hours. From his place behind the equipment building, Cornelius felt his hands stop moving on the glass. The rag hung limp in his grip. Something was happening inside his chest, a pressure building that had nothing to do with his damaged shoulders or his aging heart. What Wainwright was doing was wrong. Not just tactically wrong, not just counterproductive, but fundamentally wrong in a way that violated everything Cornelius had ever believed about leadership. You did not build Marines by tearing them down. You built them by showing them what they were capable of, by demanding excellence while simultaneously demonstrating that excellence was achievable. Fear was a tool, yes, but it was a tool that created brittle soldiers who shattered under real pressure. The greatest drill instructors Cornelius had ever known understood that the goal was not obedience. The goal was transformation. This boy in his starched uniform and his family name knew nothing about transformation. He knew only about power and the petty pleasure of wielding it against those who could not fight back. Okonkwo, Wainwright continued, you will remain in this position until I decide you have suffered enough. The rest of you, formation drill. And every time someone makes an error, Cadet Okonkwo will do 20 push-ups. Perhaps the knowledge that your incompetence causes others to suffer will motivate you to improve. The honor guard exchanged glances of muted horror. This was beyond harsh. This was cruelty designed to fracture unit cohesion, to turn teammates against each other, to isolate and destroy. And there was nothing any of them could do about it. The formation began to move through their paces. Within 90 seconds, Morrison's rifle wobbled on a spin. Okonkwo dropped to the ground and began her push-ups, her face a mask of controlled fury. 30 seconds later, Reeves mistimed a transition. 20 more push-ups. The cycle continued, relentless and vicious, while Wainwright watched with an expression that might have been satisfaction. Cornelius turned away from the window. His hands were shaking. His chest was tight. And somewhere deep inside him, in a place he had spent 6 years trying to kill, something was waking up. He walked around the back of the equipment building and into the storage area where the groundskeeping supplies were kept. He needed distance. He needed to remember that none of this was his concern. He was a janitor, a vagrant given temporary work through a charity program. He had no rank, no authority, no right to intervene in the training of cadets at an institution that would not even acknowledge his existence. But as he stood in the dim quiet of the storage room, surrounded by rakes and shovels and the smell of fertilizer, he could still hear Wainwright's voice drifting across the parade ground. Still hear the cadets counting push-ups. Still see Okonkwo's face as she absorbed abuse that would have broken lesser soldiers. She had talent. That was the thing that kept circling through his mind. Okonkwo had real, genuine talent. Her errors were not failures of ability, but failures of confidence. Failures that had been deliberately cultivated by a commander who saw her potential as a threat rather than an asset. With proper guidance, with someone who actually knew what they were doing, she could be exceptional. With proper guidance, they all could be. Cornelius closed his eyes and pressed his palm against the street Christopher medal beneath his coveralls. He thought about Rebecca, who had always known when he was wrestling with a decision he did not want to make. He thought about his daughters, who had inherited his stubbornness along with their mother's eyes. And he thought about the young woman on that parade ground, doing push-ups in the dirt because no one had ever taught her that she was allowed to be excellent. You cannot help her, he whispered to himself. You cannot help any of them. You are nobody. You are nothing. But even as he said the words, he knew they were becoming harder to believe. The mess hall at Whitfield Military Academy served dinner from 1700 to 1900 hours, and the temporary janitorial staff ate in a small alcove behind the kitchen, separated from the cadets and faculty by a wall of stainless steel and unspoken hierarchy. Cornelius sat alone at a folding table with a tray of food he was not hungry enough to eat, pushing mashed potatoes from one side of his plate to the other while his mind replayed the morning's rehearsal on an endless loop. You're not eating. He looked up to find Mrs. Delphine Garrett standing over him with a second tray in her hands. The head cook was a solid woman in her late 50s, with gray-streaked hair, pulled back in a tight bun and forearms that spoke of decades spent lifting industrial cookware. She set the tray down across from him and lowered herself into the opposite chair without waiting for an invitation. "Not particularly hungry," Cornelius said. "That is the same thing you said yesterday, and the day before." She picked up her fork and pointed it at him. "I did not pull strings to get you this placement so you could starve yourself in my kitchen." Cornelius managed a thin smile. The Veterans Assistance Program had connected him with Mrs. Garrett 3 weeks ago, when he had been sleeping in a doorway behind the bus station and surviving on whatever he could find in dumpsters. She had taken one look at him, asked a single question about his service, and made a phone call that resulted in this job. She had never asked for details. She had never demanded gratitude. She had simply seen a fellow veteran in need and done what needed to be done. "Navy," he said, "right?" Mrs. Garrett nodded. 12 years. Culinary specialist on the USS Abraham Lincoln. She studied him with eyes that missed nothing. "You never did tell me your rate." "Did not have one." Cornelius returned his attention to the mashed potatoes. Just a grunt. Nothing special. The lie tasted worse than the food. But lies were all he had left, the only protection between who he had been and who he needed to remain. Every truth he told was a thread that could be pulled, unraveling the carefully constructed nothing he had become. Mrs. Garrett chewed her pot roast in contemplative silence for a long moment. Then she said, "I watched the honor guard rehearsal this morning. From a kitchen window." Cornelius said nothing. "That Wainwright boy is going to break those cadets before the ceremony even starts." She shook her head. His grandfather was the same way. Donated half the buildings on this campus and thought that gave him the right to treat everyone else like servants. The family has money, but they have never had class. "Not my concern," Cornelius said. "No, I suppose it is not." Mrs. Garrett took a long drink of water. "But I saw you watching them, and I saw your face when he went after that young woman. Okonkwo, I think her name is." Cornelius's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Like I said, not my concern. You know," Mrs. Garrett continued as if he had not spoken, "I have been cooking for Marines and sailors and soldiers for most of my adult life. I have learned to read people, body language, the way they carry themselves, the way they hold their silverware." She gestured at his hands, which were gripping his fork in a specific manner, thumb along the spine, fingers curled precisely. "That is not how a grunt holds a fork. That is how someone holds a fork when they have spent years holding something else, something that required precision." Cornelius set the fork down carefully. "Mrs. Garrett, I appreciate everything you have done for me, but there are some questions that do not need answers." "Fair enough." She returned to her meal, and for several minutes they ate in silence. The sounds of the kitchen filled the space between them, pots clanging, water running, the distant chatter of the cooking staff preparing for the next day. Finally, Mrs. Garrett spoke again. "The ceremony is in 32 hours. Distinguished guests are already starting to arrive. I heard Lieutenant General Webb flew in this afternoon, and there are 2 Marine captains coming tomorrow morning. Sisters, apparently. They graduated from Whitfield about 15 years ago, and the Academy invited them back to give a keynote address." Cornelius's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The mashed potatoes suddenly tasted like ash. His heart was doing something strange in his chest, beating too fast and too slow at the same time. "Sisters," he repeated. His voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Twins, I think." Mrs. Garrett did not seem to notice his reaction. "Both Marines. Both captains. Can you imagine? Their parents must be so proud." Cornelius set down his fork. He placed his hands flat on the table to stop them from shaking. He took one breath, then another, forcing air into lungs that had forgotten how to work. Elise and Maya were coming here. His daughters were coming to Whitfield Academy, to this parade ground, to this ceremony. They would be 200 feet from where he slept. They would give a speech while he emptied trash cans and mopped floors and pretended to be no one. 6 years of careful distance. 6 years of watching from shadows and slipping away before anyone could notice. And now the universe had decided to put them in the same place, at the same time, separated by nothing but a wall of his own making. "You all right?" Mrs. Garrett was watching him with concern. You look like you have seen a ghost." Cornelius stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a small scream. "I need some air," he managed. "Thank you for dinner." He was out the door before she could respond, walking fast through the evening shadows toward the edge of campus where the memorial wall stood in quiet permanence. His breath came in ragged gasps. His hands would not stop trembling. The street Christopher metal burned against his chest like a brand. The memorial wall was granite, 10 feet tall and 30 feet long, inscribed with the names of every Whitfield graduate who had died in service to their country. Cornelius had walked past it every day since arriving, but he had never allowed himself to stop. Now he stood before it with his hand pressed against the cold stone, reading names he did not know and feeling the weight of names he would never forget. Rebecca would have known what to do. Rebecca always knew what to do. She would have told him to stop running. She would have told him that his daughters deserved a father, even a broken one. She would have taken his face in her hands and looked at him with those eyes that saw everything and said the words he was too afraid to say to himself. But Rebecca was gone, and the only voice left was his own, whispering the same thing it had whispered for 6 years. "You do not deserve them. You do not deserve any of this. You walked away. You chose to leave, and now you have to live with that choice." Somewhere across the campus, in a rehearsal that had stretched into the evening hours, he could hear Wainwright's voice barking commands. He could hear rifles moving through the humid air. He could hear young people struggling to become something greater than themselves, failing and trying again, pushing toward an excellence that seemed forever out of reach. And standing alone in the darkness, Cornelius Boone pressed his forehead against the memorial wall and wept for the first time in 6 years. The next morning arrived wrapped in fog, a gray blanket that softened the edges of the campus and turned the parade ground into something that looked like a memory half forgotten. Cornelius had not slept. He had spent the night sitting on his cot, staring at the photograph of his daughters, trying to calculate the geometry of avoidance, where they would be, when they would arrive, which routes he could take to ensure their paths never crossed. He had mapped the campus in his mind 100 times by dawn. Every building, every walkway, every sight line and blind spot. It was tactical thinking, the same kind of planning he had once used to move platoons through hostile territory. Only now the enemy was not foreign fighters or hostile terrain. The enemy was himself, and the battlefield was his own broken heart. By 0600, he was already at work, pushing his broom along the pathways that led to the administration building. The fog muffled sounds and turned distant figures into ghosts. He kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, trying to shrink into the invisibility that had protected him for so long. The black sedan arrived at 0645. Cornelius heard it before he saw it, the low purr of an engine turning into the main drive. He stepped behind a hedge without thinking, his body responding to instinct before his mind could catch up. Through the leaves, he watched the vehicle roll to a stop in front of the administration building. Watched the doors open. Watched 2 women in Marine Corps Service uniforms step out into the Virginia morning. Elise emerged first, just as she always had. The older twin by 7 minutes. She moved with a purposeful economy that Cornelius recognized as his own. Her uniform was immaculate. Her bearing was perfect. Captain's bars gleamed on her shoulders, and her face wore the expression of someone who had long ago learned to carry weight without showing the strain. Maya followed, and Cornelius had to press his hand against his mouth to keep from making a sound. She was laughing at something, her whole face transformed by it, and for one terrible moment she looked so much like Rebecca that the years collapsed into nothing. The same smile, the same way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the same tilt of her head when something amused her. His daughters, his little girls, standing 200 feet away in uniforms they had earned without him, living lives he had abandoned them to build alone. A welcoming committee emerged from the administration building. The academy superintendent, a retired Army colonel named Hendricks, several faculty members in their academic robes, and Sergeant Major Vance, who shook hands with both sisters and said something that made Maya laugh again. Cornelius watched Elise's eyes sweep the campus as she listened to the superintendent's greeting. She had always been the watchful one, the one who noticed things others missed. For one heart-stopping moment, her gaze passed over the hedge where he was hiding, and he could have sworn she paused, could have sworn something flickered across her face. But then the moment passed, and she was turning to follow the welcoming committee inside, and Cornelius was alone again with nothing but the fog and the ache in his chest. He stayed behind that hedge for 11 minutes, counting his breaths, forcing his heart to slow, reminding himself of all the reasons he had left, all the reasons he needed to stay hidden, all the reasons his daughters were better off believing their father was dead or gone or simply erased from existence. The reasons felt thinner than they used to. The morning rehearsal began at 0800, and Cornelius made sure to position himself on the opposite side of campus, cleaning windows on the gymnasium that faced away from the parade ground. He could still hear Wainwright's voice carrying across the distance, still sharp, still cruel, but the words were muffled enough that he could pretend they were not his concern. He was halfway through the third window when he heard footsteps approaching. Light, measured, the footsteps of someone who had been trained to move with purpose. "Excuse me." The voice hit him like a physical blow. He knew that voice. He had heard its first words, its first laugh, its first cry in the delivery room 34 years ago. He had heard it ask 1,000 questions and sing off-key to songs on the radio and whisper goodnight, Daddy, through a door he was too often on the wrong side of. Cornelius turned slowly, keeping his face angled toward the ground. Elise stood 3 feet away, her cover tucked under her arm, her eyes fixed on him with an expression he could not read. "I am looking for the administration building," she said. "I seem to have gotten turned around." It was a lie. Cornelius knew it was a lie. The administration building was directly behind her, clearly visible, impossible to miss. She had not gotten turned around. She had sought him out, and now she was standing close enough that he could see the small scar on her chin from when she had fallen off her bicycle at age 6. And he could smell the same perfume Rebecca used to wear, and his entire world was narrowing to this single, impossible moment. "Back that way," he said, pitching his voice lower and rougher than usual. He pointed without looking up. "Big building with the columns. Cannot miss it." "Thank you." Elise did not move. She was studying him. He could feel it, her gaze pressing against him like a weight. "Have we met before? You seem familiar somehow." "No, ma'am." Cornelius's hand tightened on his rag until his knuckles went white. "Just got a common face, I suppose. A lot of old veterans look like me." The silence stretched between them, filled with everything he could not say and everything she did not know. Then Elise nodded slowly, her expression still unreadable. "Well, thank you for your service." She turned and walked away, and Cornelius watched her go with eyes that burned and a throat that had closed around words he would never speak. She paused once at the corner of the gymnasium and looked back over her shoulder. Their eyes met for a single second. Then she was gone, swallowed by the fog, and Cornelius was left leaning against the window with his forehead pressed to the glass, trying to remember how to breathe. She had looked right at him. His own daughter had looked into his face and seen a stranger. He should have felt relief. This was what he wanted. This was what he had built 6 years of careful invisibility to achieve. His daughters were free of him, free of his failures, free of the broken man he had become. But standing there in the fog, with the ghost of her perfume still hanging in the air, all he felt was loss. The afternoon rehearsal was a disaster unfolding in slow motion, and everyone on the parade ground knew, except the one person who needed to know it most. Wainwright had pushed his cadets through 4 consecutive hours of drilling without a break, and the cracks were showing everywhere. Rifles trembled in exhausted hands. Formations drifted out of alignment, and the precision that should have been sharpening with practice was instead dissolving into chaos. Cornelius watched from the equipment building doorway, where he had been assigned to inventory cleaning supplies. The clipboard in his hands had not been touched in 20 minutes. His eyes tracked every movement on that parade ground, cataloging errors and calculating corrections with an expertise he could not turn off no matter how hard he tried. Cadet Okonkwo was struggling the most. Whatever confidence she had possessed at the beginning of the week had been systematically dismantled by Wainwright's relentless attacks. Her movements were hesitant now, fractured by doubt, and every mistake fed into the next in a cascading failure that was painful to witness. She was not a bad cadet. She was a good cadet who had been broken by bad leadership, and the difference was everything. The inspection arms sequence began again. Cornelius counted the beats in his head, the rhythm as familiar as his own heartbeat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. The rifles came up. The bolts pulled back. And there, right there, Okonkwo's elbow dropped that fatal quarter-inch that threw off her entire center of gravity. He saw the wobble before it happened. Saw the rifle begin its treacherous slide through fingers that could not compensate in time. Saw Okonkwo's face transform from concentration to horror in the split second before the weapon slipped free and fell toward the parade ground. The rifle hit the grass with a sound like a judgment. Wainwright was on her before the echo faded. His voice cracked across the field like a whip, loud enough that Cornelius could hear every word from 50 yards away. That is it. That is absolutely it. I have given you every opportunity to prove you belong here, and you have failed. You have failed yourself. You have failed this unit. And tomorrow, in front of Lieutenant General Webb and every distinguished guest who matters, you are going to fail this entire institution. Sir, I can do better, Okonkwo said. Her voice was steady, but Cornelius could see her hands shaking at her sides. Please, give me one more chance. One more chance. Wainwright laughed, and the sound was ugly. You have had 100 chances. À tous en chance. And every single time, you prove that you do not have what it takes. He turned to address the rest of the formation. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Excellence is not given. It is earned. And some people, no matter how many opportunities they receive, will never be capable of earning it. Cornelius felt something shift inside his chest. A door opening that he had kept locked for 6 years. A voice rising that he had spent every day trying to silence. Okonkwo stood at attention while Wainwright continued his tirade, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her jaw set against the humiliation pouring over her. She did not cry. She did not break. She simply absorbed it, the way soldiers have been absorbing the failures of their leaders since the beginning of time. In watching her, Cornelius saw himself. Not the broken man he had become, but the young Marine he had once been, standing on a parade ground at 8th and I while a drill instructor screamed in his face about mistakes he had made. He remembered the fear, the doubt, the absolute certainty that he would never be good enough. He also remembered what had happened next. A senior enlisted Marine, a legend whose name was whispered with reverence throughout the Corps, had pulled him aside after that rehearsal, had shown him, quietly and without fanfare, exactly what he was doing wrong, had demonstrated the correction with hands that moved like poetry, and had said 5 words that changed everything. You have it in you. That was all. No speeches, no motivation. Just a simple statement of fact from someone who knew what excellence looked like and recognized its potential in a terrified young Marine who was ready to quit. Cornelius had spent the next 28 years trying to be worthy of those words, had built a career on passing them forward, on finding the cadets and recruits who were ready to break, and showing them instead how to fly. He had failed at many things in his life. Failed as a husband, failed as a father. But he had never failed at this, at seeing potential where others saw only problems, at building Marines instead of breaking them. The rehearsal ended badly. Wainwright dismissed the formation with a final barrage of insults, and the cadets scattered like survivors fleeing a disaster. Okonkwo walked toward the barracks with her head held high, but Cornelius could see the tremor in her shoulders, could see the way she kept her face turned away from her fellow cadets. Could see the damage that had been done and would continue to be done unless someone intervened. He should have gone back to his inventory, should have returned to his closet and his cot and his carefully constructed invisibility, should have remembered that none of this was his concern. Instead, he found himself walking toward the barracks. He intercepted Okonkwo behind the building, in a small courtyard where cadets sometimes gathered to study. She was sitting on a bench with her rifle across her knees, staring at nothing, and she did not look up when he approached. "Cadet," Cornelius said. She glanced at him with eyes that expected nothing. "The janitor. What do you want?" Cornelius hesitated. Every instinct told him to walk away. Every lesson of the past 6 years screamed that involvement meant exposure, that helping meant being seen, that being seen meant losing everything he had sacrificed to protect. But Okonkwo was looking at him now, and her eyes were so tired, and somewhere behind them he could see the same fire that had burned in him at her age. The same stubborn refusal to quit. The same desperate hunger to be better than everyone said she could be. "Your elbow," he said quietly. "On the inspection arms transition. You are dropping a 1/4 inch, and it is throwing off your center of gravity. That is why the rifle slips." Okonkwo blinked. "How do you know that?" Cornelius did not answer. He reached out and adjusted her grip on the rifle, moving her hands into the correct position with a precision that surprised them both. "Keep your elbow pinned to your side during the transition. Let the rifle's weight do the work. Do not fight it. Guide it." She stared at him, at the way his fingers had found the exact points of adjustment without hesitation, at the way his voice had changed, dropping into something that sounded almost like command. "Who are you?" she asked. "Nobody," Cornelius said, and he walked away before she could ask anything else, before the door he had opened could swing any wider, before the man he used to be could escape completely. But as he disappeared around the corner of the barracks, he did not see Okonkwo raise the rifle and try the transition again. Did not see her elbow stay pinned. Did not see the weapon move through her hands like water, smooth and controlled and perfect. And he did not see her smile. The evening rehearsal began at 1900 hours, and something had changed. Cornelius noticed it immediately from his position near the maintenance shed, where he was pretending to organize a rack of garden tools. Cadet Okonkwo moved differently now. Her transitions were cleaner. Her rifle work was steadier. And most importantly, the hesitation that had plagued her movements had been replaced by something that looked almost like confidence. Wainwright noticed too. His eyes narrowed as Okonkwo executed a flawless inspection arm sequence, her elbow pinned exactly where it needed to be, her rifle flowing through the transition like it was an extension of her body. He said nothing, but Cornelius could see the calculation happening behind his face, could see the confusion giving way to suspicion. The formation continued through their paces. The improvement was not limited to Okonkwo. The other cadets seemed to draw strength from her steadiness, their own movements sharpening in response. For the first time since Cornelius had arrived at Whitfield, the honor guard looked like a unit instead of a collection of individuals failing separately. "Better," Wainwright said when the sequence ended. His voice carried the grudging acknowledgement of someone who had expected disaster and received competence instead. Again, full ceremony rehearsal. No stops. The cadets reset their positions. The sun was setting behind the administration building, painting the parade ground in shades of gold and amber. Cornelius leaned against the maintenance shed and watched his daughter's silhouettes cross a second-floor window. They were up there somewhere, probably reviewing their keynote address, probably thinking about anything except the father who had vanished from their lives. The ceremony rehearsal began. The honor guard marched onto the field in perfect formation, their footsteps synchronized, their rifles held at precise angles. The color guard followed with the flags, and the sequence of movements that would open tomorrow's ceremony unfolded across the parade ground. It was good. Not perfect, but good. The kind of good that came from talented young people finally being given room to succeed. Cornelius watched with critical eyes, automatically noting the small errors that remained. Morrison's grip was still too tight. Reeves was still anticipating commands by a fraction of a second. But these were refinements, not failures. These were the kinds of corrections that could be made in a single focused session by someone who knew what they were doing. The thought arrived before he could stop it. One night. He could fix them in one night. Could pull them aside after Wainwright went to bed and show them the adjustments that would transform good into exceptional. Could give them the same gift that had been given to him all those years ago. The knowledge that excellence was not a mystery, but a series of small, precise choices. He pushed the thought away, locked it behind the same door where he kept all the other impossible things. He was a janitor, a vagrant, a ghost who had forfeited his right to shape young Marines the moment he walked away from his own children. The rehearsal ended as darkness settled over the campus. Wainwright dismissed the formation with a curt nod and stalked toward the faculty housing, already pulling out his phone to report progress to whoever cared about such things. The cadets dispersed in small groups, their voices carrying fragments of conversation across the evening air. Cornelius waited until the parade ground was empty before emerging from his position. He walked slowly across the grass, his footsteps leaving dark trails in the dew that had begun to form. The memorial wall loomed ahead, and he found himself drawn toward it again, toward the names and the silence and the weight of all the lives that had been given so that others could live. He did not expect to find someone already there. Sergeant Major Vance stood before the wall with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture that of a man paying respects to fallen brothers. He did not turn when Cornelius approached, but his voice carried clearly in the still air. "I have been trying to remember where I have seen you before." Cornelius stopped 10 feet away. "You have not seen me anywhere. I have a common face." "No." Vance shook his head slowly. "That is not it. I have been in the Corps for 43 years. I have served with thousands of Marines. And there is something about the way you move, the way you hold yourself, that I cannot place. It is like watching a song I used to know, but cannot remember the words to. Maybe you are thinking of someone else. Maybe." Vance finally turned to face him. His steel-gray eyes caught the light from the memorial's eternal flame, and in them Cornelius saw the sharp intelligence of a man who had spent decades reading people. Or maybe I'm thinking of a story I heard once. A legend, really, about a drill commander who could make a rifle do things that should not be possible. They called him Phantom because his movements were so smooth he seemed to float. Cornelius kept his face carefully blank. "Sounds like quite a story." "It was." Vance took a step closer. This commander trained 3 generations of Marines, performed at presidential inaugurations, invented moves that are still taught at 8th and I today. And then about 6 years ago, he disappeared. Just vanished. No one knows what happened to him. The silence between them stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Cornelius could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could feel the walls he had built beginning to crack. "I'm just a janitor," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Just an old veteran trying to get by." Vance studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted, something that looked almost like recognition giving way to respect. "Of course you are," he said, "and I am just a retired sergeant major who still believes in ghosts." He turned back to the memorial wall. "The ceremony is at 1000 tomorrow. Distinguished guests will start arriving at 0900. I would recommend staying out of sight if you want to remain just a janitor." He walked away without looking back, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Cornelius stood alone before the wall of names, his hand pressed against the cold stone, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Vance knew, maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to connect the man he saw with the legend he had heard about. Enough to understand that the old janitor sweeping floors was not what he appeared to be. The smart thing would be to leave tonight, pack his few possessions, and disappear into the darkness before dawn, before the ceremony, before his daughters could look at him again with eyes that did not recognize their own father. He had done it before. He could do it again. But as he stood there in the gathering night, Cornelius found that his feet would not move, found that the thought of leaving, of running again, felt heavier than it ever had before, found that somewhere in the past 3 days, something had shifted inside him that he could not shift back. Tomorrow his daughters would stand on that parade ground and deliver a speech about service and sacrifice. Tomorrow an honor guard of young cadets would perform before generals and dignitaries. Tomorrow everything he had run from would be waiting for him in the harsh light of a Virginia morning. And for the first time in 6 years, Cornelius Boone was not sure he wanted to run anymore. The night before the ceremony, Cornelius could not sleep. He lay on his cot in the storage closet, staring at the single bulb that swayed gently overhead, listening to the sounds of the campus settling into darkness. Somewhere above him, footsteps crossed the floor. Somewhere outside, a door closed. And somewhere in the faculty guest quarters, his daughters were sleeping in rooms he would never enter. At 2300 hours, he heard something else. Voices carrying across the parade ground. The sharp crack of a rifle being brought to attention. The unmistakable sounds of cadets drilling in the darkness. He was on his feet before he could think, moving up the stairs, pushing through the door of the equipment building, crossing the grass toward the parade ground where 8 figures stood in formation under the pale wash of the security lights. They had come back on their own, without Wainwright, without orders. The honor guard had gathered in the dead of night to practice, driven by something that looked like desperation and pride combined. Cadet Okonkwo stood at the front of the formation, calling commands in a voice barely above a whisper. Present arms. Order arms. The movements were quiet, careful, the rifles wrapped in cloth to muffle any sound that might carry to the faculty housing. Cornelius stopped at the edge of the shadows and watched. They were trying so hard, pushing through exhaustion and fear and the weight of everything Wainwright had piled on their shoulders. And they were failing. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but in the small ways that separated adequate from excellent. The ways that would be invisible to most observers, but glaringly obvious to anyone who knew what perfection looked like. Morrison's hands were still strangling the rifle. Reeves was still a fraction ahead of the beat, and a half-dozen other errors rippled through the formation, each one minor on its own, but cumulative in their effect. Tomorrow, under the eyes of generals and dignitaries, these small failures would multiply, would compound, would transform a good performance into a forgettable one. Cornelius should have walked away, should have returned to his cot and his invisibility and the careful nothing he had constructed. But Okonkwo was adjusting her grip the way he had shown her, and Morrison was trying variations on his hold that suggested someone had been coaching him, and these young people were fighting so hard for something they did not know how to reach. He stepped out of the shadows. 8 heads turned toward him. 8 pairs of eyes widened with surprise and confusion, and, in Okonkwo's case, something that looked like recognition. The old janitor, Morrison whispered. What's he doing here? Cornelius walked to the front of the formation. His feet knew this ground. His body remembered this position. 28 years of standing before Marines, of shaping chaos into precision, of building excellence from raw material. The muscle memory was still there, buried under 6 years of deliberate forgetting. Your hands, he said to Morrison. His voice came out different than it had in days. Clearer, stronger. The voice of a man who had commanded thousands. You're gripping the rifle like you're trying to choke it. The weapon is not your enemy. It is your partner. Loosen your fingers. Let breathe. Morrison stared at him. Who are you? Nobody. Cornelius moved down the line, his eyes cataloging errors with the precision of a targeting computer. Reeves, you are anticipating. Stop thinking about the next command and focus on executing this one. The beat is not something you chase. It is something you inhabit. He continued through the formation, making adjustments. A shoulder dropped here, an elbow raised there. Small corrections that rippled through each cadet's stance like stones dropped in still water. He did not explain who he was, did not justify his presence. He simply moved with the authority of someone who had earned the right to be obeyed through decades of demonstrated excellence. When he reached the end of the line, he turned to face them all. The security lights cast long shadows across the parade ground, turning the cadets into something that looked almost like a photograph from another era. Young faces, old uniforms, the eternal cycle of service passing from one generation to the next. The ceremony begins in 11 hours, Cornelius said. You have been trained by someone who does not understand what he is teaching. He knows the movements, but not the meaning. He knows the steps, but not the soul. Tomorrow you will stand before people who have given their lives to this country, and you will either honor that sacrifice or you will waste it. He paused, letting the words settle. Okonkwo was watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. like she was seeing something beneath the surface that he had not meant to reveal. "I can show you what you are missing," he continued, "but I need you to trust me, not because of who I am, but because of what you want to become. Can you do that?" The cadets exchanged glances. Morrison looked skeptical. Reeves looked confused. But Okonkwo stepped forward, her rifle held at her side, her chin raised in defiance of every doubt that had been planted in her mind. "Show us," she said. Cornelius nodded. He reached out and took her rifle, and the moment his hands closed around the wooden steel, something shifted in the air. The weapon settled into his grip like it had been waiting for him. His fingers found their positions without conscious thought. His shoulders squared, his spine straightened. And for the first time in 6 years, Gunnery Sergeant Cornelius Boone felt like himself. "Watch," he said. He began to move. The rifle flowed through his hands like water. Port arms, present arms, inspection arms. The transitions were seamless, each movement bleeding into the next without pause or hesitation. The weapon spun on his palm, defying gravity, and his body turned with it in perfect synchronization. The cadets watched in stunned silence. This was not the shuffling old man who pushed a broom and emptied trash cans. This was something else entirely. Something that moved like poetry and struck like lightning. Something that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. Cornelius completed the sequence and brought the rifle to order arms. His breathing was slightly elevated, his shoulders aching from muscles too long and used, but his hands were steady. His hands had never stopped being steady. "That is what it looks like when you stop fighting the rifle and start dancing with it," he said. "Now, let me show you how to get there." For the next 4 hours, he taught them, not with screaming, not with humiliation, but with patience and precision and the quiet certainty of a man who had spent his life mastering something beautiful. He adjusted grips and corrected postures and demonstrated transitions until his shoulders screamed and his legs trembled with exhaustion. And slowly, movement by movement, the honor guard began to transform. By 0-300, they were executing sequences they had fumbled for weeks. By 0-400, their movements had taken on a fluidity that bordered on grace. And by 0-500, as the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the Virginia sky, Cornelius Boone stood before 8 young people who had become something new. "That is enough for tonight," he said. "Get some sleep. You have a ceremony to perform." The cadets dispersed into the darkness, exhausted and transformed. Okonkwo lingered, her rifle cradled against her chest, her eyes still fixed on the old man who had given them something Wainwright never could. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Cornelius nodded. Then he turned and walked back toward the equipment building, toward his closet and his cot, and the few hours of rest he might steal before the world changed forever. He did not see Sergeant Major Vance watching from the window of the administration building, and he did not see the single tear tracking down the old Marine's weathered cheek. The morning of the ceremony arrived wrapped in perfect weather, the kind of crystalline Virginia day that seemed designed for flags and uniforms and the solemn rituals of remembrance. The sky was a deep, impossible blue. The air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and the distant promise of summer. And across the campus of Whitfield Military Academy, hundreds of people were gathering to honor the dead. Cornelius watched from the window of the equipment building as the parade ground transformed. White chairs arranged in precise rows. A raised platform draped in bunting. Flags positioned at exact intervals, their fabrics stirring in the gentle breeze. The infrastructure of ceremony, assembled with the same attention to detail that had defined military traditions for centuries. Distinguished guests began arriving at 0830. Black sedans and government vehicles lined the main drive, disgorging men and women in dress uniforms and formal attire. Cornelius recognized the insignia of generals and admirals, the subtle markers of rank and authority that separated the powerful from everyone else. These were people who had shaped military policy, commanded forces in combat, made decisions that determined whether young men and women lived or died. And there, stepping out a staff car with 3 stars gleaming on his shoulders, was Lieutenant General Marcus Webb. Cornelius had never met Webb personally, but he knew the name. Everyone in the Special Operations community knew the name. Webb had commanded Marine forces in 3 theaters, had overseen some of the most complex operations of the past 2 decades. And according to the stories Cornelius had heard, he had once been a young lieutenant who studied film of legendary drill performances to understand what excellence looked like. The irony was not lost on him. At 0900, Cornelius watched his daughters emerge from the faculty guest quarters. They walked side by side in their dress blues, covers perfectly positioned, medals aligned with mathematical precision. Elise carried a folder that presumably contained their keynote address. Maya was saying something that made her sister smile, and the sight of that smile hit Cornelius like a blow to the chest. They looked so much like their mother. Both of them. The way they moved, the way they held themselves, the way they existed in the world with a quiet confidence that Rebecca had possessed from the first moment he met her. His wife had given them that, had given them everything good about themselves, and he had given them nothing but absence. He should have been proud, should have felt joy at seeing the women they had become. Instead, he felt only the vast weight of everything he had missed. First commands, promotions, birthdays and holidays, and all the ordinary moments that accumulated into a life. He had traded all of it for 6 years of nothing, and standing at that window, watching his daughters prepare to address an audience of generals and dignitaries, he finally understood the true cost of his choice. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 1000. At 0945, the honor guard assembled behind the equipment building for final inspection. Cornelius positioned himself in the storage room, invisible, listening through the thin walls as Wainwright addressed his cadets. "This is it," Wainwright said. His voice carried the forced confidence of someone who is not entirely sure of his own success. "Everything we have worked for comes down to the next 2 hours. I expect perfection. I demand perfection. And if any of you embarrass me out there, you will spend the rest of your time at this academy regretting it." Cornelius heard the shuffle of feet, the rustle of uniforms, and then Okonkwo's voice, quiet but clear. "We are ready, sir." Something in her tone made Wainwright pause. Cornelius could imagine him studying the cadets, trying to identify what had changed, sensing that something was different without being able to name it. "See that you are," Wainwright finally said. "Formation in 5 minutes." The footsteps dispersed. Cornelius waited until silence returned before emerging from the storage room. He had planned to stay hidden during the ceremony, to watch from a distance if he watched at all, to maintain the invisibility that had protected him for so long. But as he moved toward the back door of the equipment building, he found Sergeant Major Vance blocking his path. "Going somewhere?" Cornelius stopped. "Just staying out of the way, like you suggested." Vance studied him with those steel-gray eyes that missed nothing. "I watched you last night, on the parade ground. Saw what you did with those cadets." Cornelius said nothing. "I have seen a lot of Marines in my time," Vance continued. "Good ones, great ones, a few who were something more than great. But I have never seen anyone handle a rifle the way you did last night. The way you moved, the way you taught." He shook his head slowly. "I spent the last 6 hours trying to convince myself I was wrong. Trying to tell myself that there is no way the man I saw could be who I think he is." "And what did you decide?" Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Cornelius without a word. Cornelius unfolded it with hands that had begun to tremble. It was a printout of an old photograph, grainy and faded, showing a Marine in dress blues standing before a formation of a silent drill platoon. The Marine's face was younger, fuller, but unmistakably his own. Beneath the photograph was a caption, "Gunnery Sergeant Cornelius Boone, Silent Drill Platoon Commander, 1998 to 2012. "Where did you get this?" "Internet," Vance said. "Once I knew what to look for, it was not hard to find. There are videos, too. Hundreds of them. You performing at inaugurations, training sessions. The famous demonstration at the Marine Corps birthday ball in 2009, where you did that thing with a rifle spin that no one has ever been able to replicate." Cornelius stared at the photograph, at the man he used to be, at the life he had abandoned. "Does anyone else know?" "Not yet." Vance's voice softened. But your daughters are here, Gunny. They're about to give a speech on that parade ground. And I have to believe that whatever happened, whatever drove you away, they deserve to know their father is still alive." The words landed like hammer blows. Cornelius closed his eyes and pressed his hand against the street Christopher metal beneath his coveralls. He thought about Rebecca, about the note he had left, about 6 years of watching from shadows and telling himself it was the right thing to do. "I cannot," he whispered. "They're better off without me." Vance shook his head. "That is not your decision to make." He stepped aside, clearing the path to the door. "But whatever you decide, I thought you should know something. That honor guard out there, the one you trained last night, they're about to perform in front of Lieutenant General Webb. And if they are half as good as they looked at 0500 this morning, people are going to ask questions. They're going to want to know how a group of cadets who could barely hold their rifles yesterday suddenly transformed into something special." He paused, letting the implications settle. "Secrets have a way of coming out, Gunny. The only question is whether you control how they come out or whether they control you." Vance walked away, leaving Cornelius alone with the photograph and the weight of everything it represented. Outside, the ceremony was beginning. The sound of the national anthem drifted through the walls, muffled but unmistakable. In a few minutes, the honor guard would march onto that parade ground. His daughters would deliver their address. And Cornelius Boone would have to choose between the safety of invisibility and the terrifying possibility of being seen. He looked at the photograph one more time. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. And he walked out the door. The honor guard marched onto the parade ground at 10:15, and every person in attendance knew immediately that something was different. The cadets moved with a precision that bordered on supernatural, their footsteps striking the grass in perfect unison, their rifles held at angles that could have been measured with instruments. They were not just performing a drill. They were embodying something, channeling something, becoming something that transcended the sum of their individual parts. Cornelius watched from the back of the audience, standing behind the last row of white chairs where the families and lower-ranking guests had been seated. He had found a position that gave him a clear view of the parade ground while keeping him partially hidden behind a tree. His coveralls marked him as staff, invisible beneath notice. Just another worker watching the ceremony he had helped make possible. On the raised platform, Lieutenant General Webb leaned forward in his seat. His eyes tracked the honor guard's movements with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was seeing. Beside him, the academy superintendent looked confused, clearly aware that his cadets were performing far better than they had any right to, but unable to explain why. The drill sequence continued. Present arms. Order arms. The rifles moved through the air like extensions of the cadets' bodies, spinning and turning and catching light in ways that seemed almost choreographed. Cadet Okonkwo stood at the center of the formation, her movements fluid and confident, every trace of the doubt that had plagued her erased by a single night of proper instruction. Cornelius felt his chest tighten as he watched. This was what he had lived for. This was the art he had spent 28 years mastering and teaching. Seeing it performed by young people he had trained, even briefly, even in secret, stirred something in him that had been dormant for far too long. The sequence built towards climax. The cadets executed a series of rifle exchanges, passing weapons between them in patterns that required absolute trust and split-second timing. Not a single rifle wavered. Not a single hand hesitated. They were flawless. And then Cadet Morrison dropped his rifle. The sound of wood and steel hitting grass cut through the ceremony like a gunshot. Every head turned. Every breath stopped. Morrison stood frozen, his face a mask of horror, his empty hands still positioned where the rifle should have been. Wainwright's expression contorted with rage. From his position at the edge of the formation, Cornelius could see him already composing the tirade he would unleash the moment the ceremony ended. Could see the destruction that was about to rain down on Morrison and, by extension, every cadet who had dared to hope they might succeed. But before Wainwright could move, before anyone could react, Cadet Okonkwo did something extraordinary. She broke formation. Without hesitation, Without permission, she stepped out of her position and walked to where Morrison's rifle lay on the grass. She picked it up, inspected it briefly, and handed it back to him with a nod. Then she returned to her place in the formation and called the next command as if nothing had happened. The drill continued. The audience sat in stunned silence. This was not protocol. This was not regulation. This was something else entirely, a display of unit cohesion and mutual support that spoke louder than any perfect performance ever could. Okonkwo had violated every rule of ceremonial drill, and in doing so, she had demonstrated exactly what military service was supposed to mean. Lieutenant General Webb was on his feet, not in anger, but in recognition. His hands came together in a single sharp clap, and then another, and suddenly the entire audience was applauding. Not for the drill itself, but for the moment, for the choice, for the young woman who had understood that excellence was not about perfection, but about never leaving a fellow Marine behind. The honor guard completed their sequence and marched off the parade ground to thunderous applause. Wainwright stood at the edge of the field with his mouth hanging open, unable to process what had just happened. His perfect ceremony had been disrupted, and somehow the disruption had made it better. The keynote address was next. Cornelius watched his daughters rise from their seats on the platform and approach the podium. Elise walked slightly ahead, as she always had, with Maya half a step behind. They moved like mirror images of each other, like two halves of a whole that had learned to function independently, but never stopped being connected. "Good morning," Elise began, her voice carrying across the parade ground with the confidence of someone who had addressed far more hostile audiences. "My sister and I are honored to be here today, to stand on the same ground where we once learned what it meant to serve." Maya stepped up beside her. "We were cadets at Whitfield 15 years ago. We drilled on this parade ground. We studied in those buildings. And we learned lessons here that shaped everything we became." Cornelius felt his eyes begin to burn. His daughters, his little girls, standing before generals and dignitaries, speaking with voices that carried the same cadence as their mothers, the same quiet authority that Rebecca had possessed from the day he met her. "But the most important lessons," Elise continued, "we learned from our father." The word hit Cornelius like a physical blow. He gripped the tree beside him to keep from staggering. "Our father was a Marine," Maya said, "a career Marine. He served for 28 years, most of it in positions he could never talk about, doing things that kept people safe in ways they would never know. He taught us to stand straight, to push through pain, to understand that discipline was not punishment, but freedom. He was the best man we ever knew," Elise added. "And 6 years ago, after our mother died, he disappeared." The audience had gone completely still. On the platform, Lieutenant General Webb was watching the sisters with an expression of dawning recognition. "We have spent the last 6 years looking for him," Maya said, "following leads that went nowhere, chasing rumors that turned out to be ghosts. We hired investigators. We contacted veterans organizations. We never stopped believing he was still out there somewhere. We never stopped hoping," Elise said, her voice catching slightly, "that one day we would find him. That one day we would get to tell him what we never got to say before he left." Cornelius was not breathing. His hand had moved to the St. Christopher medal without conscious thought, pressing it against his chest so hard it would leave a mark. "Dad," Maya said, and now she was looking out at the audience, scanning the faces, searching for something she did not expect to find. "If you're out there, if you can hear this somehow, we need you to know something. We do not blame you," Elise finished. "We never blamed you. We just want you to come home." The silence that followed was absolute, complete, the kind of silence that exists only in moments when the world holds its breath. And then, from somewhere in the back of the audience, an old man in janitorial coveralls stepped out from behind a tree and began to walk toward the platform. The first person to notice him was Wainwright. The cadet colonel had been standing at the edge of the parade ground, still processing the disaster of his disrupted ceremony, when movement caught his eye. An old man in coveralls was walking across the grass toward the platform, and something about his bearing made Wainwright's instincts flare. "Stop," he called out, stepping into the man's path. "This area is restricted. Staff are not permitted on the parade ground during ceremonies. Cornelius did not slow down. His eyes were fixed on the platform, on the two women who had stopped speaking and were now watching the commotion with confusion. I said stop. Wainwright grabbed Cornelius by the arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of the coveralls. I do not know who you think you are, but you will not disrupt this ceremony any further. The grip pulled Cornelius's sleeve up past his wrist, exposing the faded tattoo on his forearm. The eagle, globe, and anchor. And beneath it, two names in elegant script that had been inked into his skin 34 years ago, on the day his daughters were born. Elise, Maya. Wainwright saw the names, saw the tattoo, and for the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across his face. On the platform, Maya had gone completely still. Her hand found her sister's arm, gripping it with sudden desperate intensity. Elise, she whispered, look at his arm. Elise looked, and the folder containing their keynote address slipped from her fingers and fell to the platform floor. The audience had turned now, hundreds of faces tracking the confrontation unfolding at the edge of the parade ground. Lieutenant General Webb was on his feet. Sergeant Major Vance was moving through the crowd. And Cornelius Boone stood in the grip of a young man who had no idea what he was holding. Let him go, Vance commanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Wainwright, let him go right now. Wainwright's grip tightened instead. This man is disrupting the ceremony. He is staff. He has no right to be here. That man, Vance said, stopping 3 feet away, his steel-gray eyes locked on Wainwright with an intensity that made the cadet colonel take a step back, has more right to be here than anyone else on this field. His name is Gunnery Sergeant Cornelius Boone, United States Marine Corps, retired. He commanded the silent drill platoon for 14 years. He performed at 3 presidential inaugurations. And those 2 officers on that platform are his daughters. The words landed like artillery shells. Wainwright's face went white. His grip on Cornelius's arm loosened, then fell away entirely. That is impossible, he stammered. He is a janitor. He is nobody. He is the reason your honor guard performed the way they did today. Vance's voice carried across the parade ground, loud enough for everyone to hear. He trained them last night, for 4 hours, because he could not stand to watch you destroy talented young Marines with your ignorance and your cruelty. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye was on Cornelius now, seeing him for the first time, seeing past the coveralls and the gray stubble and the weathered face to the man beneath. On the platform, Elise and Maya had not moved. They stood frozen at the podium, their faces mirrors of shock and desperate hope, and something that looked like it might shatter into 1,000 pieces at any moment. Cornelius looked up at them. His daughters, his little girls, standing in marine dress blues with captain's bars on their shoulders, looking at him with the same eyes their mother used to have. He tried to speak, tried to say the words he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind during 6 years of silence. But his throat had closed around them, and all that came out was a sound that was half sob and half whisper. I am sorry. 2 words. After everything. After 6 years of absence and silence and watching from shadows. 2 words that could not possibly be enough. Maya moved first. She came off the platform like a woman possessed, her cover falling off as she ran, her composure dissolving with every step. She crossed the parade ground in seconds and threw herself into her father's arms with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. Daddy, she sobbed into his chest. Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. Cornelius caught her, held her, felt her shoulders shaking against him, and smelled the perfume she wore, her mother's perfume, and something inside him that had been frozen for 6 years began to crack. Elise reached them a moment later. She did not throw herself into the embrace. She stopped a foot away and looked at her father with eyes that were wet but controlled, the eyes of someone who had learned to hold herself together because she had to. You left us, she said. Her voice was steady, but barely. You left a note, and you disappeared, and we spent 6 years thinking you might be dead. I know. Cornelius reached out with one arm, pulling her into the embrace. I know. I am sorry. I am so sorry. We do not want sorry. Maya lifted her face from his chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We want our father back." The three of them stood there on the parade ground, holding each other while 400 people watched in absolute silence. Lieutenant General Webb had removed his cover and was holding it over his heart. Sergeant Major Vance was standing at attention, tears tracking down his weathered face. And the cadets of the honor guard, the young people Cornelius had trained the night before, had formed a loose semicircle around the reunion, creating a barrier of respect and protection. Wainwright stood alone at the edge of the scene, his face a mask of confusion and dawning shame. Everything he thought he knew had been upended in the space of 5 minutes. The vagrant he had mocked and dismissed was a legend. The janitor he had ordered around was a Marine who had dedicated his life to the very excellence Wainwright claimed to pursue. Lieutenant General Webb descended from the platform and approached the family. He waited until Cornelius looked up, until their eyes met before speaking. "Gunnery Sergeant Boone." His voice carried the formal weight of decades of command. "I studied films of your performances when I was a lieutenant. Your work is still taught at 8th and I. It is an honor to finally meet you." Cornelius straightened slightly, his arms still around his daughter's. "The honor is mine, sir." Webb nodded. Then he turned to address the assembled crowd. "I had prepared remarks for this ceremony," he said. "Remarks about sacrifice and service and the meaning of Memorial Day. But I think we have just witnessed something that says it better than any speech ever could." He gestured toward Cornelius and his daughters. "This is what we serve for. This is what we sacrifice for. The chance to come home. The chance to hold the people we love. The chance to be forgiven for the burdens we carry." He paused, letting the words settle. Gunnery Sergeant Boone gave 28 years to the Marine Corps. He gave everything he had. And when he lost his wife, he lost himself. But today, in front of all of us, he found his way back. He came home. The applause started slowly, a few hands clapping in the silence, then building like a wave until it washed over the entire parade ground. 400 people on their feet, applauding not a performance, but a reunion. Not excellence, but humanity. Not perfection, but the ragged, beautiful mess of family putting itself back together. And in the center of it all, Cornelius Boone held his daughters and wept. 3 months later, the leaves had begun to turn on the old oak tree in the backyard of the house Cornelius had built with his own hands 30 years ago. He stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the morning light filter through branches that had witnessed his daughter's first steps, their graduation parties, and countless summer afternoons that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The house had been maintained in his absence. Elise had taken over the mortgage payments. Maya had come by every month to cut the grass and check the pipes. They had kept it waiting for him without ever knowing if he would return, without ever giving up hope that one day he would walk through that door again. He had been home for 11 weeks now. 11 weeks of sleeping in a real bed. 11 weeks of meals at a table instead of on the street. 11 weeks of slowly, painfully learning how to be a father again to daughters who had become women without him. It was not easy. Nothing about it was easy. There were days when the guilt pressed down so hard he could barely breathe, when he woke in the middle of the night, convinced he did not deserve any of this. There were arguments and tears and silences that stretched too long. There were therapy sessions that left him feeling hollowed out and raw. But there were also mornings like this one. Coffee on the porch. The smell of bacon drifting from the kitchen where Maya was cooking breakfast. The sound of Elise's voice on the phone with her commanding officer, requesting an extension of her leave. "Dad." Maya appeared in the doorway, spatula in hand. "Eggs are ready. You coming in?" Cornelius turned to look at her. His daughter, his little girl, wearing an apron that had belonged to her mother and smiling at him with Rebecca's eyes. "Be right there," he said. The kitchen table was set for 3, the same table where he had eaten thousands of meals before everything fell apart. Elise was already seated, her phone set aside, her attention focused on the stack of pancakes Maya had prepared. "I talked to the commandant's office," she said as Cornelius took his seat. "They want to know if you would be willing to consult on the new drill manual they are developing." Cornelius raised an eyebrow. "They want me?" "They want the Phantom." Maya set a plate of eggs in front of him. Turns out that video from the ceremony went viral. Someone in the crowd recorded the whole thing, including what happened afterward. Last I checked, it had 12 million views. The video, Cornelius had avoided watching it, had avoided reading the comments and the articles and the endless speculation about where he had been and why he had left. The story had spread far beyond Whitfield Academy, picked up by news outlets, and shared across social media until it seemed like everyone in the country knew the name Cornelius Boone. Some of the attention had been welcome. Veterans organizations had reached out with offers of support. Old Marines he had served with had tracked him down to reconnect. And 3 weeks ago, a letter had arrived from Cadet Sarah Okonkwo, thanking him for what he had taught her and informing him that she had been accepted into Marine Corps officer training. Other attention had been less welcome. Reporters calling at all hours, documentary producers wanting to tell his story, and one particularly persistent journalist who had managed to track down the shelter where he had spent 2 winters, digging for details about his years on the street. He had declined all interviews. His story was not for public consumption. It belonged to him and his daughters, and that was where it would stay. What happened to the Wainwright boy? He asked, changing the subject. Elise and Maya exchanged glances. He resigned from the honor guard, Maya said, voluntarily. Apparently what happened at the ceremony made him reconsider some things. The academy offered him counseling, Elise added. He has been meeting with Sergeant Major Vance once a week. From what I hear, he is actually starting to understand the difference between authority and leadership. Cornelius nodded slowly. He had not wished harm on Wainwright, despite everything. The boy was arrogant and cruel, but he was also young. Young enough to learn, young enough to change. And if what had happened on that parade ground had planted a seed of humility in him, then maybe some good had come from the whole mess after all. After breakfast, they drove to the cemetery together. It was a ritual they had established in the weeks since his return, a weekly visit to the grave that Cornelius had avoided for 6 years. The headstone was simple white marble, engraved with Rebecca's name and the dates that bracketed a life that had ended too soon. Cornelius knelt on the grass and pressed his palm against the cool stone. His daughters stood behind him, their presence a warmth at his back. I brought him home, Becca Maya said softly, just like I promised. Cornelius closed his eyes. He could almost hear Rebecca's voice, that gentle laugh she had, the way she would have looked at him with those knowing eyes and said something that cut right to the heart of things. I'm sorry I ran, he whispered. I'm sorry I was not strong enough to stay. But I am here now, and I'm going to try to be the man you always believed I could be. The wind stirred the trees overhead, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. Somewhere a bird was singing. And for the first time in 6 years, Cornelius Boone felt something that might have been peace. The drive home was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet. The kind of silence that exists between people who do not need to fill every moment with words. As they pulled into the driveway, Maya broke the silence. The academy called yesterday. They want to establish a new drill training program. Named after you. Cornelius stared at her. They want to name a program after me? The Boone Excellence Initiative, Elise said, focused on building Marines up instead of tearing them down. They want you to help design the curriculum. Maybe even teach some sessions yourself. For a long moment, Cornelius did not know what to say. A year ago, he had been sleeping under an overpass, convinced he would die alone and forgotten. Now he was being asked to shape the next generation of Marines, to pass on everything he had learned in 28 years of service. I do not know if I am ready for that, he finally said. Maya reached over and took his hand. You do not have to be ready. You just have to show up. The rest will come. Cornelius looked at his daughters, at the women they had become, at the love they had somehow preserved for him despite everything he had done to push it away. Okay, he said, I will show up. If this story moved you today, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember that every person you pass on the street has a story of their own. Some of them might just be legendary. We would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us about the quiet heroes in your life, The people who deserve recognition for the battles they have fought and the burdens they have carried. And if this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing that broken things can be made whole again. And thank you for remembering that it is never too late to come home. That evening, as the sun set behind the oak tree and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cornelius sat on the porch with his daughters on either side of him. Maya had brought out an old photo album, and they were looking through pictures of summers long past. Birthdays and holidays, beach vacations and backyard barbecues. A life that had been interrupted but never truly ended. And when Maya pointed to a photograph of Rebecca holding two infant girls in her arms, Cornelius did not look away. He looked at his wife's face, at her smile, at the joy in her eyes. "She will be proud of you," he said. "Both of you. She will be so proud." "She will be proud of you too, Dad," Elise said softly. "For coming back. For trying." Cornelius nodded. The guilt was still there. Would probably always be there. But it was no longer the only thing. Alongside it now was something else. Something that felt like hope. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars he had once taught his daughters to name on summer nights just like this one. He leaned back in his chair and looked up at them, at the vast wheel of light that had been turning since before humanity existed and would continue turning long after everyone alive today was gone. "You know," he said, "I used to tell you girls that the stars were the souls of everyone who ever loved us, watching over us from far away." "I remember," Maya said. "Mom used to say you were too sentimental for a Marine." Cornelius smiled, the first real smile in a very long time. She was right. I was. I still am. He reached out and took his daughter's hands in his own, holding them gently as the night settled around them. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on me." "Never," Elise whispered. "Not ever," Maya agreed. And there on the porch of the house he had built, surrounded by the family he had almost lost forever, Gunnery Sergeant Cornelius Boone finally allowed himself to believe that he had found his way home.